at the very beginning of the field of peace research or peace studies, or whatever we're going to call it, people came into the field from very, very different backgrounds, very, very different disciplines, very different life experiences. So tell us a little bit about yours, if you would.
It's probably unusual. I got involved in it through a combination of heredity and chance.
Mm-hmm.
The heredity is that both my parents came from Quaker families, though they were not active Quakers themselves.
Mm-hmm.
My maternal grandfather was an early advocate of peace and pursuer of these problems.
Mm-hmm.
He was Canadian, who came here with an invention, became highly successful as a businessman, and ended up as a Liberal member of Parliament before the First War. And he devoted a lot of his time to trying to avoid war and pursuing the cause of peace, to the point where when the First World War broke out, he was in Germany leading a mission or delegation of English churchmen of all denominations to meet German churchmen of all denominations. And he and his colleagues were sent across the sort of early lines of scarcity form in a special train. That was one generation. And in the next, my mother's elder brother devoted his whole life to the cause and indeed won the Nobel Peace Prize. He was called Philip Noel Baker, and he'd added the name Noel Baker. My mother worshipped him almost excessively, and so I was brought up with all this in the background. And that is the heredity. I think my feelings about the matter were probably intensified during the war. I was at school for half the war. I joined the RAF. I was invalided out while I was still under training as a pilot. But I then got into operational research, which involved analysing the effect of different types of operations quite empirically. And I spent a few months at the end of the war doing bomb damage assessment in Germany. And I saw as a young man, I was under 21, I was 20 I think, by then, Hamburg, Kiel, God knows what. I mean, scenes of destruction. And earlier I had seen a little of the horrors for the air crew who got slaughtered at an appalling rate. I happened to work in a crew room for a bit on a bomber station whilst allegedly under training. And the horror, the fear, the difficulties of morale and the casualty rates amongst those people were very scary. And one saw the horrors of war, particularly of bombing. I did, from both sides. I then came back to Cambridge, I read economics, and the first job I had was in the United Nations, which rather fitted my internationalist ideals, in Geneva as an economist in an organisation called the Economic Commission for Europe. And the head of that was Gunnar Myrdal, a great Swedish economist and social scientist, whose wife also was a great social scientist. They both won Nobel Prizes, one for peace and Gunnar for economics. And after that I came back to England and I worked in government for a time, I was here for a time, and then I was in London at the National Institute doing empirical research, which was always my bent. And then I went to work for the Labour government in 1964. I was economic advisor to the Treasury, a political appointee, and I became thoroughly disillusioned because they would not do the one thing that they obviously needed to do, which I kept advocating, which was to devalue. And whilst I was sitting there, fed up and wondering what to do next, I got a telephone call from Gunnar Myrdal, who knew me from Geneva, saying, "Brother," in his odd Swedish way, "brother," he said, we're just setting up a little institute, you must come and run it. It's very good, it's for peace." And those were his extremely shorthand words.
So, with that persuasive argument, what happened?
Well, I was rather amazed and said, "Good heavens," and he explained a bit more, and he then put on Alva, his wife, who really was the mother of the institute rather than he, she explained quite a bit down the telephone. And I said I'd call them back, and I did. I consulted my wife, and then said I want to go and explore this. And we went to Stockholm for a long weekend or something to find out what it was all about. And it was then I discovered something of the history of SIPRI. Roughly put, and you can look this up in plenty, there's a history of SIPRI, no doubt know.
Frank Blackaby's.
The Frank Blackaby's history. Roughly put, there was at that time, great concern about the arms race and disarmament, particularly on the part of Alva, and about conflict in general. In Scandinavia, peace research had become fashionable. An institute had been set up in Norway, Trio, and had got a lot of attention as being a new venture in trying to deal with these problems. There was another, I think, already in Finland, and the Swedes then came to the moment when they could celebrate 150 years of peace.
Of course, yes.
The last war they'd had was in 1816 when they walloped the Danes and pinched Norway, to put it briefly.
Temporarily they pinched Norway.
Well, yes, but for quite a time. And at that stage they wondered what to do, and somebody had the idea of creating a peace research institute rather than putting up a monument in stone or concrete, which was of less sort of human value. And they'd had a committee that had explored the idea, and the government had approved it, and with remarkable enlightenment agreed that the government would pay but hand the money over to an international board to run an international institute not ruled by the Swedes, at arm's length. They had considered what sort of work to do, but had left it pretty vague. There was one thread which was not very strong, suggesting roughly, and it wasn't put this way, that they should pursue sort of theory and understanding of the nature of conflicts and that kind of thing. And there was another much stronger thread, I think, or perhaps much is an exaggeration, a stronger thread suggesting that they should go for more applied work and policy issues and so on. I am not a theorist and felt that theory was already being adequately pursued in Norway and perhaps in Finland and in what was then becoming a mainstream peace research community, rather dominated by sociologists. And I felt that more empirical work, more closely related to what was going on, was needed, and also the kind of thing that I understood and of which I had experience. I paused and said I was attracted by the job, but I wouldn't take it until I had drawn up a work program which I felt was achievable and would fit the budget and got the board's approval. Because if I came without that, I might find myself at odds with the board, that we had different ideas. The whole thing was so loose, it wasn't clear what would go and what wouldn't. So I spent, I think, a couple of months, during which, or a month or so, I went to the States. I was going anyway for the Treasury to the annual meeting of the Monetary Fund and Bank. And I talked to very many people in the United States and in England, really getting two things. One, their ideas, and secondly, seeing how far one could rely on support from people who really mattered in the relevant fields.
Was there anybody you particularly remember who was helpful at that?
Well, here I suppose Ollie Zuckerman I certainly talked to. I think he was on the board of SIPRI. I may have talked to Patrick Blackett, I don't know. I surely talked to my uncle, Philip Noel Baker, though he was such a wild optimist that I always discounted his views a bit, that I think he influenced me, morally in some degree. In the States, goodness, Matt Messelson to do with chemical and biological warfare. The man who was head of MIT, who had been Kennedy's scientific advisor, Jerry Wiesner. I think I saw Henry Kissinger, who I think was on the Scientific Council of SIPRI. And I can't remember, and people around Washington. I had contacts in quite a lot of places. And I drew up a program which the board accepted. And this consisted of empirical work, essentially. And there were three big projects. One was on chemical and biological warfare. Another was on the arms trade with the Third World. And the other was to create a yearbook recording what was going on in the arms race.
Could you tell us a little bit more about how you decided the program at SIPRI and why you went off in the directions that you did? Mainly, I think, tell us a little bit about the genesis of the yearbook, which remains very important, but you were responsible for that.
Well, my essential approach was that there was a very dangerous arms race going on, and which influenced the Third World, partly through the flow of arms there, and the main direct confrontation, principally between the United States and Russia and the Soviet Union, and that people's understanding of it was extremely limited because of lack of information. And I was particularly struck, indeed why I came up with the idea of the yearbook, was that I had looked at these problems before, written little things about the economics of disarmament, and always been concerned about these matters. And I knew the publications produced by the League of Nations. And in that period between the wars, governments provided masses of information on the size of their armed forces, their budgets, everything to the League, and it was all published. And disarmament negotiations took place, admittedly unsuccessfully, but informed in detail as to what was going on until bust up came and Hitler withdrew and so on. Since the war, there was a blank on the map. The United Nations produced yearbooks on population, national income, food, anything you like to name, health, the lot. But on the mainstream problem of war and peace, which the UN was meant to prevent, it produced no information at all, none on arms, anything like that. The Russians wouldn't provide any. The Americans were probably quite glad not to, with the Russians taking the flak. And instead, all that we got, essentially, was what was released by the Americans. The Russians released virtually nothing. And that was remarkably good intelligence, but inevitably the selection of what you got was from one side of the war, as it were. Also, the main source of information at that time, for anybody interested in this, was produced in London at the Institute for Strategic Studies, which was essentially a sort of outpost, a useful one, of modern American strategic thinking about the nuclear arms race, financed largely in the first place by American foundations or I don't know who. And it produced an annual yearbook called the Military Balance. Now there are two features to that. One, it gave no sources at all for its information. It made perhaps vague research governments, but there was no footnote saying where each thing came from. They were there, ex cathedra in that sense. The second was that it had a focus on balance, implicitly assuming that balance is what kept the peace. If one side got ahead, that was really dangerous, and the other side must catch up. This is the implicit philosophy, and that actually is a very dangerous philosophy which precisely engineers or generates an arms race, because each gets fearful the other side's ahead. The fact is that precise balance in most cases doesn't matter, and for other reasons it's not a good criterion to use. And the other thing that happens when you do that, I produce a statement about the balance vis-a-vis you, I'm almost certain to point out the bits where you've got ahead and say, look out, and it becomes an alarmist document. And insofar as the Russians published anything, theirs would be documents that probably used American data, but to point up the places where America was ahead, so that in a way, a regular statement of a military balance was tended to feed arms race thinking into a competitive mode. And so I felt we were very badly in need, or there was a need to get information, put it together as well as you could, always stating your sources. We always used public sources. I didn't want any secrets. Couldn't keep them anyway from one part of the staff to another. And secondly, that we tended to look at things as to how levels of arms were moving, who was going up and down, what had been the cycle, so that you saw what was happening as part of a dynamic process through time, as an arms race, one going ahead, the other going ahead, which made you see it, not as a critical balance we must fuss about, but as a moving process you ought to be concerned about. And that was the implicit philosophy to it. If you like, what we were doing was running an open intelligence agency. What was happening, coming out of America was intelligence information, processed in London, and we were taking it and producing everything we could get, piecing it together, but always with sources, and giving and acting, as if you like, as a private intelligence agency. Indeed, after we've been going 2 or 3 years, one of the number twos at the CIA came to see me. And he said, I want to know how you run this place, how you got it off the ground like this. He said, you know, you've got the best private intelligence agency in the world. And because the places like the CIA work on open information too. But I think we had a huge advantage in being free of any bureaucracy, any preconceived notions, and simply taking the stuff afresh and looking for what was new. Any established bureaucracy has a fixed mode and goes on looking for the same old thing, I suspect, but I don't know, I've never been inside all that. So what we were doing was trying to open up information as an aid to policymakers, for that matter, politicians, campaigners, anyone else. So they should have reliable information with which to debate policy.
What about the other side of things, the Russians, the Soviets? How well did you manage to get information from them? Were they interested in what you were doing? Did you ever get visits from the KGB?
Well, one never knows that. Of course one did. Yeah. The answer is they gave one no information. And essentially, it may have been trivial bits. And they were very much interested, but they were pretty much angered at times because we went into things such as arms trade with the third world and all this kind of thing, exposing what each side was doing. They were no worse than anyone else. It's very symmetrical, all this stuff. I particularly upset them early on because in producing the yearbook, I first wrote to all governments, having planned the yearbook, and it was excellent staff, Frank Blackwood and lots of other people there. We drew up all the types of information we'd like to have. We didn't think too unreasonable to ask for. And we sent questionnaires to every government in the world. So we're starting a yearbook, perhaps saying it something like what the League did.
Mm-hmm.
And we will make our own estimates if we can't get them from governments, but if we could, we'd be very glad. Here's a questionnaire. Will you please let us have whatever information you can? Well, we got back practically nothing, you see, except for a few virtuous people like the Swedes and some other Scandinavians and maybe the Swiss. I can't remember some odds and ends.
Yeah.
But the point was it covered us against being accused of being irresponsible or anything like that.
Yeah.
And then we sent estimates to governments when we made our own,
Mm-hmm.
asking for comments. And it meant we could publish it saying we have consulted governments as far as we could, we've done everything possible. If anybody sees anything wrong, tell us.
Mm-hmm.
And it got us on to sort of relatively firm ground.
Okay.
But there was a moment when I was about to go to Russia, and we had sent whoever was the chap here in Moscow a letter asking for a hell of a lot of this information.
Mm-hmm.
And I got back a letter, I think about the rudest letter I've ever had, accusing espionage and God alone knows what, and a real old-fashioned sort of communist stuff. And I had a very good Czechoslovak aide from, who was very loyal to me and was very canny, as Czechs can be, so managing to keep in a bit with both sides.
If you're Czech, you have to be. Yeah.
Yes. I said, for God's sake, this is what on earth has got this awful letter. And he read it and said, right, what are you worried about? Why are you surprised? I said, God, I've never had a letter like that. And he said, look, you sent this guy a letter asking for all kinds of information that's highly classified. He's got to send back a letter like that to you to show that he's in no degree implicated in what you're up to. So one did have ups and downs.
Mm.
If you ask about KGB, well, God knows, we've never known any country who. One of the noticeable things was that when we had odd meetings and working groups on particular things to do with biological warfare, this, that, or the other, seismic detection of underground tests. It was noticeable there was always somebody in the Russian team and somebody probably in the American team who was a very keen photographer. And I never sort of thought about this. And perhaps very kindly would send you pictures of a meeting and this, that and the other. I never thought about this till some chaps from the United States turned up on a particular subject. And I introduced myself and explained who I was. And the guy, who's an academic, came in and said, okay, you don't have to explain who you are. We heard all that in Washington. I know what you look like. And you realized all these damn photographs.
That you go into a file.
So, yeah, sure, I didn't get that kind of thing. But it never worried me in the slightest.
One of the names that people always ask when we ask questions about conferences that they've been to and for helpful meetings is Pugwash. So was Pugwash at all helpful to you at this particular time?
Oh, it was jolly important, yes. In the first place, they had been consulted. They usually means Joe Rotblat, who was the father and dictator, God bless him, of it. And they were keen, particularly on the chemical and biological warfare project. As scientists, they rightly were exercised about it. And that was a very good thing. And then, yes, I used to go regularly, I think, to every one of the Pugwash conferences while I was there. And they were useful, principally, I suppose, for, well, fundamentally they were useful as a sort of back channel to the Soviet Union. It was a place where Westerners and Russians and other Eastern Europeans could get together, slightly more loosely, if you like, than through the more formal channels. And that was always useful. And it was, Pugwash was very pleased to have the kind of information that we produced when it started coming up. And one was quite glad to get their reactions and to debate and so on. No, Pugwash was the most useful.
Any others? Because more or less the same time the International Peace Research Association started up.
I went to that once or twice, and I found it Useful because I met bright young chaps who were concerned and interested, and in particular there was one I think I met through that Anders Boserup, that's Dane,
Oh yes.
who very tragically died young, with whom I worked a lot later. And he was originally a physicist and gone off.
What's he now?
Yes, he was at the Niels Bohr Institute. He was a very clever man. He had then gone after the sort of sociological approach to peace research and was becoming, if not disillusioned, at least he felt he wanted to try something else. And he came to SIPRI for a stretch.
Ah, okay.
And there were other odd people whom I think I recruited through that circus, if I may call it that.
Now, many people have used that word about it. So.
But I did not find the performances useful. They were all sociological, and there was a tendency for them to be sort of dogmatic and sometimes unnecessarily sort of provocative and controversial. I on the whole, didn't get much out of the debate. It was dominated by the kind of school behaving like, a religious group having a quarrel with another religion, and they were theoretical and this and the other. They're not a religion, but there were group conflicts of that kind, which one must expect.
Oh yes.
Now there was one other question you sent me, what was peace research a discipline?
Well, that's an interesting question. We had a variety of answers to it. So what would yours be?
No. It certainly wasn't in my time, and I very much doubt it is now. This was a sort of, almost a cliche around SIPRI, which Gunnar and I certainly shared. I regard peace research as being like cancer research. It's a problem, and it's a problem that's very bad, grave, and causes a lot of death. And you want anybody who can to see if he can do anything to solve it, relieve it. But you cannot say it's a discipline, because a discipline requires that you know a path of action that you can pass on to someone else that solves a problem. That does not exist. We don't in cancer research. Cancer research is not a discipline. All sorts of people have a go at it. And peace research wasn't, and I suspect isn't at all a discipline either. I think there's an analogy that if the problem is ever solved, of peace and conflict, the solution will probably be analogous to what seems to be happening in cancer research, namely that fundamental knowledge of how the entity that is suffering the problem really works is necessary before you can arrive at a solution. In other words, understanding all the things through the genetic code and how cells behave more and more minutely, with fundamental knowledge of the human body, now that you can scan it in such detail and so on, will in the end, if anything does, produce results, rather than the sort of external observation of symptoms, not totally trial and error, but less deeply worked out problems. Now, in the case of peace research, one has to, so I think you have to start from the proposition that human beings are born with two instincts. I'm not sure instincts is quite the right word, but two ingrained patterns of behavior that come from some combination of genetic inheritance and perhaps conditioning and superimposed. And that very common behavior is that you have trust and cooperation within a family or a small group that may get extended to a tribe or something like that, coexisting with mistrust, fear and competition with other families, tribes, groups, races, whatever it is. And this coexistence of in-group, let's call it cooperative behavior, and out-group competitive behavior, is that. We're not going to get over that. unless we alter people's genes or do something like that. But in order to understand profoundly how this works, why we're quite like that, and indeed whether by any switching a gene could change this, you must wait, I think, until knowledge of genetics and also how the brain works expands, as has the knowledge of the body. And the knowledge of the body has expanded fantastically in my lifetime. We're just beginning on knowledge of the brain, to be able to sense it, scan it, analyze it, do this, that, and the other. And it's certain that knowledge is going to expand, and it may expand explosively, God knows, with new tricks of understanding and devices. And maybe one day we will then understand why there is conflict and so on. But until then, I think we're going to be grappling as best we can, trying to limit to this, that, and the other, to the conflicts that occur, recognizing that they're going to go on, and that you are grappling with these instincts that can be inflamed or moderated this, that, or the other way. But that is all we can say. We can't say very much more. Now, maybe wonderful things have happened in peace research that I don't know about, but since the amount of conflict and everything else going on is absolutely undiminished, it can't be much use so far, is all I can say. So, in the long run, I'm optimistic, and I'm all in favour of people going on, seeing what they can do to moderate it, and it's highly desirable, and I'm all in favour of the information function continuing properly. But it is not a discipline, and I think it won't be for a very long time. But it is a massive problem, like cancer research. We must keep going.
Looking back at the people you said influenced you very much in that era, it was very much people from the natural sciences. There was always a very strong sense of...
Who have I mentioned?
Well, Solly Zuckerman, for example.
Yeah, I didn't say he influenced me. I consulted them as to what sort of work he thought was relevant and could be done, because I did want to make it empirical. If you theorize, there's no limit to what you can speculate about, but if you're going to do empirical work, you've got A, to have a serious question or problem to look at, and B, be fairly confident there is material that you can assemble which may throw light on that problem. Yes, I think physical scientists were important, because we were concerned about an arms race which had huge technological content in terms of nuclear weapons, delivery systems, chemicals, this, that, and the other. But on the other hand, there was, the yearbook, which was rather wider about what was and wasn't happening in disarmament negotiations, and perhaps costs and this kind of thing too. But I think Gunnar and Alvin Yeda were very important. And Gunnar they were both very strong on sticking to empirical evidence and not taking off into the air.
Well, there is a very strong tendency within some parts of peace and conflict research to follow that. I mean, people like David Singer, you know his work on the wages of war, that particular tradition. And there's a strong tradition which our old friend Michael Nicholson was part of, to follow up on arms race models and the use of mathematics. Michael was always very, very, very keen on using mathematics, which he always argued ferociously was very different from statistics or empirical work. Mathematics was always something slightly. And I always thought that was probably because of his background as an economist, but that doesn't seem to have been something which was very strongly in your mind.
No, I was never a mathematical economist. I mean, I use statistics, certainly. And sometimes, one had problems where one needed to seek the help of a mathematician when the logic was becoming a bit too difficult. But there was a growing school at that time that is now dominant, that spends its time reasoning in the abstract, using algebra and mathematics, modelling things, rather than looking at data. It may then fit to data, but there's an awful lot of abstract modelling, which for somebody with mathematical talents, which I don't possess, which Michael Nicholson did, is very attractive, because it's a process of reasoning going on and on from one step to another. They enjoy complicating things up, which is an expression that occasionally one hears used. And I have never regarded that as terribly fruitful if it takes off from variables that you can measure fairly precisely, so you don't even know what you're talking about. But you can sometimes arrive at results that are interesting. Some bits of game theory have done so.
I was going to mention that.
And, well, the curious thing is that I don't think game theory was helpful to the mainstream arms race, the nuclear arms race, though a lot of people think it was, for the very simple reason that a nuclear confrontation, think of the Americans and Russians, is not a game in which people again can make repeated moves and consider what the other one's going to do and keep moving, which is the nature of game theory. On the contrary, it's not a game at all. It's somewhere where you like to sit down at a chessboard and put a lot of pieces on it. But what happens is if you make one move, the probability is the whole bloody room will blow up and that's the end of it. So you can't have...
There won't be a board.
What?
There won't be a board.
There won't be a board or you or anybody else.
No.
Now, you can, find results about... But tit for tat is the best way to get out of some prisoner's dilemma kind of confrontation. That's very interesting for some things, but it's not terribly clear that it has any relevance to a nuclear confrontation where you both possess mutual assured destruction and so on. Well, you can't be tit for tat. It's just bluff, and that's all there is to it. And I think an awful lot of people pretending that they had arrived at the most important results and got grants to do peace research on nuclear confrontations, to which I don't really think it was very applicable.